Again. Oh, one story, of course, now that I started the recording. So let me make a long story short so I can get to the part I want to tell, which is not going to be long either. On last November, my sister I'm her guardian. She's in Midland. She had a retinal detachment. So that was an ordeal. I never realized a retinal detachment is such a big deal. It turns out that this past Wednesday, on a follow-up visit down to Royal Oak, so up to Midland down to Royal Oak, the retina redetached. So drive back Wednesday, drive back on Friday, retinal surgery Friday, stay Friday night, come back, go to a follow-up on Saturday and drive back here Saturday. So that's between last Wednesday and Saturday and now. But anyway, the point is that on Wednesday I was driving back. It was 8 o'clock or yeah, 8 o'clock or so. I was on M46, which is one of those state roads between Midland and here when you want to get to 127. And before I got to 127, I'm getting this severe weather warning, thunderstorm warning alert. And I see it there, and I'm going, man, I don't know if I can get to 127 before this hits. And I didn't. So I'm going 55 miles an hour, and it hit with the wall of wind and rain and brought visibility down to the front of my truck. So I brought it to a stop, and this wind and rain was hitting, and I couldn't see outside. And I had my foot on the brake, and it felt like I was still moving. And I let my foot off the brake, and it's moving. And I thought, man, what am I having here? Am I having a stroke, or am I having a brake failure? What is going on? So it went on for about 30 seconds, and I finally got to be able to see one of the yellow lines in the middle. And so I stared at it to try to tell if I was moving, and I said, okay, I'm not moving. And there's now cars parked on the road behind me and in front of me. And it went on for like 30 seconds. And then finally it cleared enough to keep going and get to the highway. But that's in my drive in 49 states or whatever. I have never been brought to a stop on the middle of a highway because of a rainstorm. That was the first. 64 years old. What else? Rain and wind. Didn't get reported. Wasn't like trees were coming down. There was none of this. It was just it hit and then it blew through in 30 seconds. Anyway, it was unbelievable. So that's not important, but I told it anyway. Okay, let's get going here. We are talking about the Old Testament and specifically what I think of as our heritage. We use that word to mean different things in the Christian world. Usually what we mean is, there's this book that I highly recommend it. There's a book called Great Leaders of the Christian Church. It's like 2 or 3 pages on every major personality through back in time, all the way to the apostles almost. Polycarp and Justin Martyr and all these people from the early church fathers and so forth, all the way forward. And so when we think of Fox's Book of Martyrs, if you don't know if you've ever heard of that, but these are the kinds when we think of Christian heritage, usually that's what we think. When I think of Christian heritage, I think of how we got our Bible, because that is one of the most amazing stories in the history of the world. That we have an English Bible, that we have the Bible in the original language, which I have here. The original language in the Old Testament is Hebrew. The original language in the New Testament is Greek. But that we have those, we have recovered those very confidently. So it's really not disputed. And that we now have English translations, and translations in every language we can translate, looking for new languages to translate, all of which are based on the recovery of the original text of both the Old and New Testament in the language in which they were written. That to me is the greatest part of our Christian heritage, period. I'm just going to make it as an absolute statement. That's what we share in common as the people of God. And we don't get any credit for that. We had nothing to do with it. There were thousands of people involved in that, none of whom understood at the time their place in the grand project of preserving the word of God, which is what it was. But God was in charge of that project. And he raised up inspired writers, and he raised up, unbeknownst to themselves, copyists who were not inspired. They just needed to copy, and any human can do that. And that's what happened. And so I'm not one who believes that the people who copy manuscripts down through the centuries are inspired. I don't have to believe that, and I don't believe that. But I do believe the original writers were. We'll talk maybe later in the summer about what inspiration is and inerrancy, but that's what we're talking about today. So I think we're on the last of 3 weeks on the Old Testament. And that's what I mean by the history of the Old Testament, the history of the writing itself. Obviously not in detail because I can't talk that deep about it. I'm a rank amateur, but I can say some stuff, so I am. And the story that it tells, I have called the rise and fall of Israel. And what you see here is a very simple schema of the rise and fall of Israel and some of the major, in white, some of the major turning points and forks in the road in the rise and fall of Israel. So let's see, where are we? Last week we finished with this little thing called the Ketef Hinnom, which we're not going to talk about today, but which to remind is let's see, where do we want to be here? We want to be on 614. This little, sometimes it's called an amulet because it's hung around the neck. Sometimes it's called a scroll, which it is, and you can see the rolls if you imagine it being rolled up. But this is a 600s BC silver scroll of number 6, the priestly blessing. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and so forth. And we talked about that last week. That's the oldest piece of, that's the oldest fragment of the Bible that is in existence today, which is, in my opinion, 900 to 800 years after that was written in the 15th century, in the 1400s BC. Important stuff to these people. They didn't have access to a lot of writing. So when they could, they wrote it on silver and they hung it around their neck. And they did that sort of thing for 800 years. That's why we have it. We have it because these people thought it was really, really important to preserve. That's why we have it. So thanks be to God for that. Hinnom is a gravesite, I guess you could call it. Valley of Hinnom. What does Ketef stand for? It doesn't matter. Don't get me sidetracked. Don't get sidetracked, Gary. All right. Let's move on to the Dead Sea Scrolls. So back to our little diagram. The history of the written word, written Old Testament, we're proceeding in my simplistic schema. We're proceeding from the Septuagint to the maybe the Latin Vulgate. You wouldn't believe probably wouldn't believe that the Latin Vulgate, which we'll get to in a little bit, played an important role in the preservation of your Old Testament, but it did. And then on to the Masoretic text, which, if you've never heard of it, you read it every day. Every day you read the Old Testament, you're reading the Masoretic text, and we'll get back to that. So let's talk about the Septuagint. Or no, I'm sorry, we missed one. The Dead Sea Scrolls. Let's do this in an orderly manner. We want to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, so let's go to our big diagram. This is our summer right here. We're going to talk our way down this timeline. This is the timeline of the transmission of the Word of God. If I had 20 feet, it would be a lot more detail. But I don't. I've got that, 8.5 by 11, so that's what we get. So we're going to proceed from this Ketef Hinnom. I have amulet, but you could also say scroll right here. 600s. So this right here is the 600s. There's 700, 800, 900. There's 600, 500, 400, and so forth. Just so you know, or think about it, the 600s are which century? 8th, 7th, or 6th? 8th, 7th, 6th, or 5th century BC, the 600s. The 600s are the 7th century. What is the 1900s? AD. That's the 20th century. So you can see how that goes, right? So this, I decided to put it by the, not by the century, but by the years. This is the 600s right here. And it goes backwards. 500s, 400s, 300s, 200s, 100s. And then there's the turn of the millennium right there. So here's the Ketef Hinnom silver scroll right here, about 600 or so, just before the exile of Israel. Every single thing, well, I don't have that many, so it's not that big of a deal. But all this stuff in white, Moses, David, Solomon, first temple, exile, the return from exile, second temple, all of that is in your Old Testament, plus a whole lot more. I have a diagram down here. We're going to say the same thing about the New Testament. If you think none of this matters right here, except for Jewish revolt, Dead Sea Scrolls, everything else in white is in your Bible, is in the New Testament. So if anything's up, when we get there, if anything's a surprise, or you think it doesn't matter, it mattered to someone, and that someone was an inspired writer. We'll get back to that. But back to our diagram. So let's talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Perhaps one of the most important archaeological find in biblical history? No. Now, those absolute statements never seem to work. One of the most important archaeological finds in biblical history. Certainly the most important archaeological find of the 20th century, which is what years? 1900s. That's exactly right. All right. So yeah, Dead Sea Scrolls, you have notes on this. I think I gave you some notes on this, didn't I? I've got it on my page too. I've got a little more elaborate. Now, who doesn't have notes that wants them? Okay. So let's talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I've actually got it backwards. Then we'll talk about the Septuagint. Since I already started, I did it backwards after all. Should I turn it back around and talk about the Septuagint? Okay, we're not going to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. We're going to talk about the Greek Septuagint. So the only reason they are roughly concurrent with each other. The Greek Septuagint, which we'll get to right now, was written in the 200s and 100s BC. The Dead Sea Scrolls were written in the 200s to BC to 100s AD. So they overlap and they're independent. But they are also independently very important to the understanding of our Old and New Testament. So let's go ahead and talk about the Greek Septuagint. Septuagint, which I mentioned before, is simply Latin for 70, because the urban legend is that, I don't really know how this works, these Hebrew scholars before Jesus in the 200s or so, maybe a little bit earlier, wanted to reconstruct the Old Testament, but in Greek, not in Hebrew. And we'll talk about why they wanted to do that in a second. But in order to do that, they chose supposedly 6 scholars from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, which gets you to 72. So I'm not really sure how 70 got it. But anyway, none of that really matters, but that's the popular history of that story. Huh? Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it's a little English thrown in the middle of the Latin. At any rate, let's take a look at why this is the case. We're going to go to our New Testament storyline right here. Okay, so I'm going to make this big so you can see it better. And I might actually be able to use my, if you're going to spend 20 bucks on a pointer, you want to be able to use it. It's got this like tactical handle on it. Like it's the end, it's an end of the world laser pointer, just in case after the end of the world you need to use a laser pointer. Then this thing, if you have a USB port that you can recharge it on at the end of the world. But anyway, okay, so let's talk our way through this a little bit. here we are right at the very beginning of the timeline in the sixth. Now this is centuries. Sixth century is the 500s and so forth. I've had this diagram for a couple of years now. But here's some events, all of which are in the Bible, in your Old Testament, and a lot more. Let's see. And what happened was the Babylonian Empire rose to power in 612 BC, conquered the Assyrian Empire, which had already conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, the 10 northern tribes, driven them into exile, destroyed everything, the wasteland. Then the Assyrian Empire was conquered by and replaced by the Babylonian Empire in 612 BC. And they then, under Nebuchadnezzar, invaded and conquered the southern kingdom of Judah in 586, although I might have 587 right here. I don't have anything. But there's the exile of Judah right there under the Babylonians. About, 60, 70 years later or so, what's 540 to 590? More like 45 or 50 years. They were conquered by the Persians, which is more like Iran. So the Babylonians are to the east, Iraq, modern day Iraq. And excuse me, the Persians are farther to the east, modern day Iran, which are Persians. The Iranians are Persians. And that's the flashpoint in the world right now. I'm rooting for the Persians to take their country back, just so you know, unabashedly. But anyway, under Cyrus, the Jews in exile that they inherited from the Babylonians were permitted to return to Judea to rebuild Jerusalem and the Temple of Solomon, which was destroyed. So the Temple of Solomon, prior to the exile, represents the first temple period, this back here, before the timeline, before 586. That's the first temple period. That's the period of Solomon's temple. The temple gets destroyed. The land is vacant for that many years, from 586 to whenever they're allowed to return, sometime around the turn of the century in 500. And it took a while after the decree by Cyrus for that project to actually begin and end. But eventually, we see the story in Ezra and Nehemiah, both, of the reconstruction of the temple. That begins what's called the Second Temple period. So if you ever see that in writing, the Second Temple period, you're talking about the period of time after the Second Temple was built in exile, when the Jews were allowed to return. Now, even though they were allowed to return, they're not a nation. It's not like the Persians or the Babylonians or the Assyrians or the Romans or the Greeks were going to allow a nation to be constituted the way we think of a nation. They're not going to allow they're going to allow vassals. So King Herod in the New Testament period, yeah, he was a king, but he was a vassal king who paid homage to Rome and money, and a lot of it, and worked the favor system and the political system to get what he wanted. That's how things work. And so now we're in the period of Persian rule, very friendly to the Jews, and so they now begin to return. However, most Jews did not return. Most Jews stayed in exile. They settled in, and many of them did very, very well. Their families did very well in exile. In the New Testament, we meet one particular person who had a family that did very well in exile as a Jew. What was the name of that person? Huh? Saul, also called Saul was the Jewish name. Paul was the Roman name. Paul was a Jew whose family had been in exile for hundreds of years, who somehow they had earned or been granted their freedom, the male, one of his fathers, and then he passed that freedom on to the Roman citizenship, let's use that word, and he passed that citizenship on to Paul. So Paul was born a Roman citizen, not a slave. So Paul was one of those whose family way back hundreds of years ago, came into exile as slaves, and then eventually gained their citizenship. We might call it freedom, but it wasn't freedom in the way that we think of it. But they gained their citizenship, their way out of slavery before Paul was born. During that period between the birth of the Messiah and going into exile right here, somewhere in here, in the middle of that line. While they're in exile, Hebrew falls into disuse among what we call among these Jews, who are often called the dispersion. The Jews dispersed after the exile, the diaspora, the dispersion. Peter calls them what in his book? The chosen sojourners. The strangers that are temporarily who are in a place that is not their home, right? Chosen of God, the exiles, and so forth. That's how he opens his letter, specifically written to the Jewish dispersion, to the Jews dispersed in, and then he lists a bunch of different regions of the Roman Empire at that time. So for anyone who thinks that 12 tribes are lost, or 10 of the tribes are lost, you'd have to convince Peter of that because he's writing to them. I'm just saying. The Jews dispersed. Anyway, the question is then, if they can't speak Hebrew to make their way in exile, what language are they going to speak? Well, the Persians, over time, the Persians are then conquered by the Greeks. Specifically, who? Alexander. He is called the Great because he defeated the Persian Empire at, let's see, a couple of years older than Dana and a couple of years younger than Laura. I was, I don't know what I was doing, but I wasn't conquering empires. And so he conquered from Macedonia and Greece all the way over past Persia. And there was a question of whether he was going to get all the way to India. His appetite for that was almost insatiable. And I think he had to be convinced by his generals to not do it, to not just keep right on going. So anyway, as I said before, one of the things that happened as a result of that was that he, if you want to think of it this way, gifted, certainly the conquered probably didn't think of it this way, he gifted those areas with a common Greek language and what will end up being a culture, a common culture, which will be pagan and will involve polytheism, the worship of many gods. So what will happen is these gods that the Greeks worshipped will then be taken over, they will be assimilated into the beliefs of the native peoples wherever they go. And so you will often have, like you did with the Romans, you'll have a Greek name for the god or goddess and a Roman name for the god or goddess. And a good example of that is the story in Ephesus, story in Acts about Ephesus. And the Ephesians are upset because they think that these Jews are profaning their gods. And so they end up screaming at the top of their lungs for 2 hours, what? Close. Great is Artemis, of the also known as Diana. Right. Yeah, so there's these that's how it happened. But anyway, the point is then that all of this is going to swirl among the Jews. They're going to be forced to live in this midst of this pagan idolatry, and they're going to be forced to speak this language that is not theirs, called Greek. And so, if enough time goes by, they all speak Greek in the dispersion. But the Bible, their Bible, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, is written in what language? Hebrew. So these people back in Alexandria, these Jews back in Alexandria, which is a center of Jewish life and educated Jewish life during the dispersion, during the period of what's called the post-exile, this period here, after the exile, they begin to think, well, what are we going to do here all the Jews that went into exile, they don't speak Hebrew anymore. They're going to lose touch with their ancestral traditions, which is to say the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. Let's translate the Bible into Greek. So that's what they did. What manuscripts did they use to translate the Bible into Greek? I don't have any idea, and neither does anybody else. But they did it. And so we'll get back to that when we talk about the Masoretic text. And so they translated the Hebrew Bible over a long period of time, decades, maybe longer, into Greek. And this then was the Bible that, along with commerce and travel, made its way through the territories that these Jews lived in. And so, oh no. Well, they don't speak Greek today, right? Yeah, nor do they need to. They don't need that. But anyway, so that's why this is green. The green is the Greek part. So Greece, the Greek Empire after Alexander, it lasts about 10 seconds and ends up fracturing. And that's a long and sordid story. That's where you get Ptolemies and what's her name? Cleopatra. Cleopatra was a Greek queen of Egypt, a Greek, not an Egyptian. And in spite of what popular culture says, but therefore, it's one of those great ironies of history where the Jewish scholars who are devout Jewish scholars who hold the Hebrew Tanakh sacred are the ones who think to use the tool at their disposal, what Alexander did in gifting them Greek, to go ahead and create a Bible that their own people could continue to read. And so in these synagogues, by the time of Paul, when he traveled around the eastern provinces, Macedonia, Achaia, Asia Minor, Galatia, Syria, Cilicia, when he traveled around those provinces and he went to synagogues, he could either speak to them in Greek or in Aramaic, which was sort of the street language of the Jews. I think in the eastern provinces they did more Aramaic, but certainly in Achaia, Asia Minor, and Macedonia, they spoke Greek. So that was all ready for Paul. That was ready and waiting for Paul. Not only could he go to these places and preach the gospel and persuade these people about Jesus in a common language as exiles, but he could do it knowing that they had a Bible that they could read this, that they had been reading this stuff on. So these devout God-worshiping Gentiles and proselytes, if they were involved in these services or wherever they went, they had a Bible. They thought of it as, the Jews thought of it as, we want our people to have access to our ancestral traditions. My vantage point, no, I'm a Gentile. I want the Gentiles to have access to their ancestral traditions, because out of their ancestral traditions will come a Messiah for the Gentiles. And so it turns out that unwittingly, the Jews in Alexandria created the means by which Gentiles, the gap could be bridged for Gentiles to have a Bible, so that you have a foundation now when Paul comes in to preach about Jesus and the fulfillment of Isaiah. They can sit there and look at it in their own language and read it. It's unbelievable story. You call it a miracle? If you're going to call it a miracle, it's more like 10,000 miracles. It's the hand of God working its way across the pages of history, and he don't care. Just like in Genesis, he doesn't care what anybody does. He's going to get his way. Kingdoms can rise and fall, whatever happens, and he's going to get his way. So that's the layman's side of the story of the Septuagint. The point being, we have that today. We have the Septuagint. And what is the oldest copy of the Septuagint? Is that the? Let's forget about that for a minute. But anyway, the point is, that was the Bible. Certainly, when Jesus got up in the synagogue in Nazareth and quoted Luke chapter 4, they're probably not reading the Septuagint in a synagogue in Nazareth. At least I don't think they are. But when Paul, what was Paul's Bible? Maybe he had access to a copy of the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. But he was a Hellenized Roman who grew up in Tarsus. So, you got to think he's used to the Septuagint. But when you see a quote in the New Testament, you're probably seeing a quote from the Greek Septuagint. The Jews probably didn't anticipate that either, that these pesky Christians would end up using their work to not only disseminate the gospel, but in the formation of their own sacred script, the Christian sacred scripture, what we call the New Testament. All right. So that's the Septuagint. What more do I have to say about that? I got some details here, I guess. Oldest fragment is from the mid-2nd century BC, so we're talking 100s BC. Found in Egypt. Oh, I do have a picture. The Rylands fragment. I'm going to escape. Wrong escape. You're hearing me exclaim to myself. It's a nasty habit. I also have the nasty habit of half starting sentences and not finishing them. And people are listening to me. And I'll go, man, I really need to. And then I just stop. And, but anyway, let's go take a look at a couple of images of this. Old Testament, that's codices. We don't want that. What was I doing? What was I talking about?
Ryland script.
Oh yeah, Rylands. Yeah. Let's see. Where did I put Rylands? I probably should have been better prepared. There's 452. That's John. Isn't there another Rylands fragment? Oh yeah, right. No. Where's Rylands fragment? 458. So this is the oldest fragment of the Septuagint. Thought I had a picture of it in the library. I mean, in the museum. But you can see the fragments you're not going to get a lot of text out of that. But just, when you sit there and look at that, these little pieces survived 2,100 years in the sands and popped out of the sands in, 1800 and something, or even some of the other stories are of manuscripts that we can trace them back to the 1400s or something. And then there's wars and, fires and stuff like that. And then suddenly the manuscript pops up again in 1800 and something. And you go, what happened between 400 and something, 1400 and something and 1800 and something? And it just pops back. That happened with one of the most important, or actually all the most important New Testament codices or books that we use now to develop our Greek text of the New Testament. They just appear again. They've been hidden. They've been silently sitting in some monastery, St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai. I think it's St. Catherine's. Just been sitting there in some container how did it get there? Nobody knows. But they got preserved, and it was sitting there waiting for some monk to pick it up and burn it for kindling. And this is a real story. We'll talk about it later. And some guy who happens to notice what he sees in front of him and manages to save it from the ashes. And then you sit there and think, what did they burn? I thought, no. Well, let's look at the John one. This is how John's fragment is even smaller. It's this little, the fragment of John that we're going to talk about later is, it's like, it's 2.5 by 4 inches. or something like that. So this is 2.5 by 4 inches fragment of the Gospel of John, chapter 5. Look at the attention it gets in the museum. That ain't normal glass, right? That nobody's going to bust through that glass. Indiana Jones ain't doing it. Nobody's busting through that glass. That's in England, the British Museum, I think. But yeah, how much is that worth? I mean, if they were going to sell that thing, I don't know what you sell it for. But also inside of that, that's not air. There's no normal air inside of that. It's either vacuum or it's filled with some gas that preserves it. It doesn't spend hardly any time in the light. When I went to the what's the one in Dublin? What's the university? The famous university there. Anyway, I went there in January of 2020, and they've got a bunch of manuscripts there, including some of these fragments from the early 200s, late very end of the 100s. And what they do is they're very delicate, and light, the environment kills this stuff just by virtue of existing. So what they do is they put it to sleep. It goes into a tightly controlled vault, environmentally controlled vault for 10 years, and they'll let it out for 1 year for display in a very controlled environment, still always behind this glass. And then they put it to sleep again for 10 years. And so they'll rotate what they wake up, so to speak, they'll rotate out for display, and then it goes back to sleep again. And that's how they treat this stuff. So this is probably a temporary exhibit. I'm sure it just doesn't sit there, not with that sunlight coming in. So that's the Gospel of John. We'll get back to that. I thought I had the same thing for 458, the fragment of the Septuagint. But anyway, let's see what else about the Septuagint. It is used by one of the most important. If you ask, well, what did they copy for the codices, the early codices of the New Testament, which we have from the 300s, 300 years after the New Testament period? What was their what Old Testament did they translate into? What Old Testament did they use? And the answer, in the case of Codex Vaticanus, which we'll talk about, is two of them, actually Sinaiticus as well, I think, is the Septuagint. They just used the Septuagint. So I believe Vaticanus is the oldest copy of the Greek New Testament in existence, and we have that copy. We have Vaticanus from the middle of the 4th century, the 300s AD, which is about 400 years after the Septuagint is written, maybe a little more, 450 years, not much time.
But Dublin that you saw.
What's the university?
Yeah,
Trinity. Yeah, it's interesting. Maybe I'll bring my pictures. I'll flash them up and we can take a look at them. But it's interesting when you go to a place like that, because you'll see architecture, you'll see buildings and form structures that are hundreds and hundreds of years old, interlaced with brand new buildings. And you'll see a wall that's hundreds and hundreds of years old, and then suddenly it's new wall, and then it's back to who knows how old wall. It's just all mixed together. And so that's what I remember being struck by. I'm walking on Trinity's grounds, and there's a new building, and then this thing that looks like a castle. And I'm going, that ain't new. That's, I don't know how old, but yeah. And over there, the Catholic churches are unbelievable. The architecture, what went into the planning and design and engineering for these churches, they're just sitting all over the city. Ireland, there's the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Ireland is Catholic. And so there's these Catholic churches everywhere, and all of them have this, or a lot of them have this, the middle of them rises up. You've seen them all the time, right? There's like a spire, some kind of right in the middle of it, it'll extend up for who knows how high, 100 feet or more. And so when you walk into these churches, I remember being struck by this. You walk into the church, and you're drawn to the middle where the light is coming down through this, whatever you call that, and which kind of it draws you in, and then it wants to draw your eyes and mind up. So the architecture infuses you with a sense of the reverential just by virtue of the design of the building itself. That's all on purpose. So anyway, we'll talk about that later maybe. But that is the Septuagint. I'm going to give you an example of this, and that is Luke chapter 4. I don't have it up. Luke chapter 4, verses 18 and 19, very famous. What is it? World changing direction in the history of the redemption of the people of God. Have spoken out of the mouth of Jesus himself.
That's Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount.
The Spirit of Jesus walks up to the front of the synagogue. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord. It's got Jubilee written all over it. But anyway, that's a sermon, not today. So the question is, what version? What was the text of the Hebrew Bible that he was reading right here? And was he a slave to it? Or does the Son of God have permission to recite however he wants from memory or whatever that is, right? And so if you take a look at it, I think I got it here. So on the left is Luke, and on the right, you have is that ours? I forgot now. Somebody open up 61, Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the afflicted. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, for freedom to the prisoners, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord, and the day of vengeance of our God. So whatever he was doing, he wasn't slavishly reciting a text. My hunch is he opened up the scroll and he started reading, and then he took his own liberty and he said exactly what he wanted to say rather than just slavishly quoting from the text, which is probably one of the things that set him off. I mean, if I treated this, the point is, for these people, you read the text. There's the text. You don't monkey with the word of God. You read the text. So either he was reading some other version that they had, or he ain't reading any version. Not when he doesn't want to. And so he comes up with this. And my hunch is, if he was doing that, they're thinking, who's this guy think he is? I mean, already he's already strike 1 and 2. Now he's going to say something about it. Now not only is he going to do that, then he's going to do his own commentary on it. Strike 3. That's how that happens. That'd be a great scene to have watched. I think if we watched it, if we could see it happen, we would go, oh, I totally understand how this happened. And he did it on purpose because he's a prophet, and a prophet is not welcome in his own country. And from the day he announces himself as the one who will set at liberty the captive and proclaim the same favorable year of the Lord and so forth. From the moment he did that, he had already set himself on the road to crucifixion as the prophet who was not welcome in his own country. And there's no prophet who can die except outside of Jerusalem. So that started from his first statement, not later, but from his first statement. That's what I think. Does anybody want to comment on that? We're outside the bounds of what we. You'd need an English translation. I can read a little bit of it, but it's a different, it is Koine Greek. It is the Greek of it is the Greek of, it is the Greek of our Bible. It's the same Greek language. There's several different Greek languages that, like English. If you go back and we're going to look at Tyndale's version of Tyndale's translation of the Greek text into English in the 1500s, you have to work. It is hard to read. That exact same thing happens, where in fact letters go out of favor. And so there's classical Greek, there's Attic Greek, there's Akkadian, I think, and then there's Koine Greek, which is the Greek of their empire, the street language, like English is today. That's the language that not coincidentally, that's the language the New Testament is written in, and that's the language the Septuagint is written in. Not the professionalized, not classical Greek, like what the philosophers would have written in, but the vernacular Greek, the vulgar Greek. Latin Vulgate just simply means, it's not vulgar in our common sense, in our understanding of the word. Latin Vulgate means common Latin. So everybody can read it. That's the idea. That things change with that. But anyway, that's a Septuagint. It's the Bible of the empire. It's the Bible of your God-fearing Gentile. Out and about. And it's the Bible you're going to read frequently. Sometimes it's a bit of a mystery, but it's the Bible you're going to read that is quoted from in the New Testament. So it's the Bible of Luke, we presume, and so forth. Especially if you're writing to Gentiles. Many of the books of the New Testament are written to Gentiles. They're not written to Jews. So even Hebrews, think about this, which is understood to have been written to Jews. Was it written in Hebrew or was it written in Greek? It was written in Greek. To the 12, 1 Peter, to the 12 tribes dispersed abroad. Hebrew or Greek? Greek. So you're not going to quote, if you're going to do a quote, which he does in 1 Peter, a holy nation, a royal priesthood, a people set apart for his name or something like that. You're not quoting from a Hebrew. You're not doing it in Hebrew. You're doing it in Greek because that's what everybody spoke. So they were, the writers of the New Testament, they used the Septuagint. You'll often see it. If you see when you're reading, if you see LXX, that means that's simply the Latin for 70. L is 50, XX 10, 10, 70. They used it, but they were slaves to it, and he certainly wasn't. He can do anything he wants. Any questions or comments about the Septuagint?
Did you? Septuagint for the Hebrew, our Old Testament is translated from?
The one we have in our Bible?
Yeah.
Hebrew. We'll get to that, hopefully. It's already 10:08.
Yeah.
What happened here?
5 on your phone.
All right. Let's talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Let's talk about Qumran. About the same time, here's the Septuagint. Judaism in what we often call the intertestamental period, the period between the two testaments. It's often called the silent years. It was anything but silent. It's only silent from our vantage point, but it was not silent to them. Some of the most active years in the history of Israel happened between, let's say, Ezra and Nehemiah, and when you see the New Testament world open up. But Judaism became the word we might want to use is sectarian. These different groups, you have a sect, S-E-C-T, a sect here and a sect there. So you have in the New Testament, you have the Pharisaical sect, the Sadducean sect. I don't know how to say that. I don't know if you want to call the Herodians, they're just a political group. And then there's one more, you might call them the begins with an S, but let's just call them the Zealots, the revolutionaries. Begins with an S. Somebody can look it up. I don't remember. They got destroyed at Masada after the Jewish war. But anyway, those are the ones you're going to see some representation of all four of those in the story of the New Testament. Revolutionary fervor is all over the place, and you'll see that pop up in Acts. The Tribune is going to have a little argument with Paul about who's better, who's higher status, and he's going to say, "Oh, I thought you were the Egyptian who caused some trouble a number of years ago." You know, there's your revolutionary fervor coming into play, which will seal their fate in the 60s. But anyway, another of the sectarian groups were the Essenes, Essenes. And these were, let's call them, they're like the Amish. They were separatists, not in the sense that they were trying to create a new nation like in Star Wars or something with the separatists and so forth. They were separatists in that they wanted to retreat from what they considered a corrupted society and religious situation in Judea. So they thought that the high priestly class, and they were not wrong, was corrupted, and it was descended from corruption, and they were not wrong about that either. But so they withdrew, and they settled along the shores of the Dead Sea. We'll look at a map later. Maybe a mile from it, in these caves, they had these communities, a community, or I don't know if there was more than one, where they now lived out their, almost like we could think of it kind of like a monastic existence, where they just simply withdrew from the wider society, which they did view, not because they wanted a new political situation, but because they wanted religious purity. And they were looking forward to the return of the king. And so that's what they were doing. And they were the Essenes, and they chose to do that along the Dead Sea, because who wants to be there? If you want to withdraw from society, you probably don't want to do it, you know, in downtown Chicago, north side of Chicago. We're going to withdraw from society. Where do you want to do it? Hey, let's get a bunch of apartments over there in the middle of downtown Chicago. That's not where you're going. You're going to go to the place where nobody wants to be. And so they went to this desolate area around the Dead Sea, which came to be called Qumran. So Essenes at Qumran. Qumran was the location. Let's see, they were apocalyptic, looking forward to the end. Ascetic, Ascetic, which means basically self-denial, ritual purification, self-control, those types of things. Heavily immersed, no pun intended, in the idea of purification, religious purification. So whatever the Pharisees were, you know, the religious purity was a big deal, the washings and so forth. Jesus didn't, you know, how come the disciples don't do this and that and wash your feet and so forth? They had nothing on the Essenes. The Essenes would have thought they were all corrupt. So they were ascetic, like the monastic movement in the Christian tradition centuries later, male only, to be religiously and morally pure. So they had their community rules and so forth, and that's where they lived their lives. But they did something else. These people would not stop copying. They copied. So Old Testament, Tanakh, the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, because they probably believed that it was being corrupted. Copy. Other writings that they valued, copy. So of the Qumran finds, which we'll talk about, only about 40% of those are biblical. The rest of it is all the other stuff that they copied. But anyway, they believed they were the true remnant of Israel. And then, well, I'll close with this, what do you want to call it? Cliffhanger. I don't know. Yeah, this will really bring you back. In 1947, the Bedouins, who in one of the great ironies of history, what kind of people were Bedouins? Arabs, not Jews. Bedouin sheep herders, herdsmen were messing around for whatever reason near this site that had been buried for and forgotten about for 2,000 years or more. They were messing around in there or over there. And one of them, the story is a little shepherd boy, but sure, George Washington chopped down a cherry tree. Who knows whether any, he probably did chop down a cherry tree sometime, but he throws a rock or they wander into a cave, became known as, I think it became known as cave number 1. And they find these, to make a long story short, they find the find of the century. There are these papyrus manuscripts in these clay jars in an environment, it turns out, that is optimal for preserving just such a thing, which then happened. And those in those caves, just sitting there in this desolate region, there they sat for 2,000 years, waiting for an Arab, of all people, to wander in and go, oh, look at that. But of course, all they wanted was money. So now the hunt is on. We got to find buyers for our thing because we don't care. We're trying to make a living. And so that's how the great Dead Sea Scroll finds began. So we'll pick that up and talk about that next time. Sakari, those are the revolutionaries. Thank you. I think that's also probably where they got in the Avengers. That's where they named their aliens that were in. Where does the Rosetta Stone fit in? I have no idea, but I'll look it up. I don't know.
I have a lot of experience looking for.
I don't even know what that is. Just a minute. I mean, I've heard of it. It's a something or other inscribed with 3 versions of a decree issued in 196 BC by the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt. So you're right back to what happened after the Greek Empire fractured, after Alexander died. This has nothing to do with the Bible. No. I'll look at it, but it has nothing to do with the Bible. Yeah. All right. Well, that's it for now. See ya.